Welcome to Louisiana, 1854. The air is still tonight thick, heavy, sweet, with the scent of cane and ash. A photograph, small, silvered, no larger than a man's hand, rests inside a locked drawer of an attic that no one has opened in a century. At first glance, it's ordinary. A woman seated beside a wooden porch, eyes lowered, hands folded in silence. But if you look closer, the light catches something beneath her gaze, something not meant to be seen. Historians call it an artifact of the time, yet no one can explain the shadow that crosses her lap, or why her reflection in the glass doesn't match the angle of the sun. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what you felt the first moment you saw her face. Because somewhere between your screen and that photograph, history is waiting to speak again. The image was taken by an unknown itinerant photographer. His name lost his records missing. But the plate survived, cracked, faded, whispering a story that the archives tried to bury. In that still frame, the world of 1854 breathes again, whispers of a life caught between freedom and silence, between truth and the erasure of memory. Some say the woman was never identified. Others say her descendants still live by the river, but refuse to speak of her. Maybe that's why, when the photograph was found, the attic light flickered, and a single sheet of paper slid from beneath it. A date, a name half erased, and one sentence trembling in old ink. She knew before anyone else what would come. So tonight, we return to that photograph. To her eyes and the truth they carried, even when history tried to look away. Louisiana, 1854. The river turns like a great animal rolling in its sleep. Slow, heavy muscle beneath a sheet of moonlight. Spanish moss hangs from the cypress like old handwriting, each strand a sentence the wind keeps trying to read. The air is a weight on the chest, warm, damp, tasting faintly of iron, sugar, and smoke. Cane fields ripple in long green chords, a single note held by the night. Frogs sew the darkness together with their voices and then stop, all at once, as if warned. A sidewheel steamer breathes out on the far bend paddle, slapping water with the patience of a clock. Somewhere a barge bell answers, not a church bell, but metal struck by a tired hand, the sound thinning as it drifts over the levee. Dog barks scale the ridge loud near, then swallowed by distance. Fireflies salt the ditch line, moving punctuation in a sentence the marsh refuses to finish. By the river road, plank boards creak under wagon wheels, resin-scented sticky with sap, a geometry of fatigue and travel. Telegraph rumors move faster than horses' wires are coming, they say, a web of humming lines that will bind town to town. But here the news still arrives in paper and breath, a folded broadside, a whispered report at the mill gate, a name traded for a favor. The sugar mill shudders like a tired lung gears, bitten by cane juice iron, sweating in the heat. Steam lifts and drifts, sweet and metallic, a halo that makes everything near the stack glow, and then disappear. Inside the press groans a sound you feel more than hear, and the floor remembers every foot that ever crossed it. Buckets knock, chains clink, a door slams, and echoes, as if the building were bigger than it is. On the ridge, cabins stand with their backs to the wind. Clapboard faces, weathered gray roofs held down by stones and faith. Door frames shine where hands have touched them for years, oil and prayer, making a quiet polish. Windows breathe yellow through chinks, candlelight as thin as a vein. At one threshold, a chair, a folded quilt, a palmetto fan, a child's tin cup dented to the shape of a small mouth. On the sill, a Bible soft with use, a dry sprig of river mint tucked where a verse once stopped someone's tears. She lives here, the woman from the photograph. They called her Etta. Maybe that was her name. Maybe it was the name that would keep her safe. Her posture is the kind that doesn't ask for room, but quietly claims its shoulders drawn to protect the breath. Hands folded not in piety, but in calculation. 10 fingers, 10 tools, 10 compass points for a life to measure. Her eyes carry weather, the kind that can look at a sky and tell you who will get wet. A child sleeps on the pallet, not hers, they say. Or perhaps fate decided otherwise. Wrapped in old linen, the weave thin as memory, smelling of soap smoke and a river that never quite lets go. When the night shifts just slightly, like a door in a house settling, the child wakes and listens for what Etta hears. Is it coming again? The child asks, not fully awake. Etta doesn't answer with words. The answer is in her breathing longer, slower, as if to ease the air itself. Farther downriver, quarantine flags have hung for weeks, yellow like warning teeth. The city breathes with a fever. No one can see ships moored, cargo stalled, names counted with more care than usual. Inland storms have come early. Cane scorched black in stripes, fences scattered the ground, remembering every hoof that ran. Men talk softly at the store porch, words trimmed to fit inside the distance between two rocking chairs. A whitewashed notice flaps against a post, dates prices, rules the ink already running in the humidity. Sundays, the chapel beyond the tree line holds a square of light like a bowl catching rain. The preacher's hands move like birds, opening, closing, trying to gather the scattered into a single flock. Hymns travel without instruments, breath, hand clap, foot on wood, a human drum that finds a spine and straightens it. Some lift their eyes, some keep them low, each person choosing where to place their private sky. On the back wall, the Last Supper is more absence than paint faces ghosted by years of weather, the table an idea more than an object. Etta stands to the side, not against the wall, not in the aisle, a place chosen for seeing without being seen. She does not mouth the words, but something in her hums a second melody under the first, a small current beneath the river. When the congregation breaks and the field takes their voices back, she lingers, head tilted slightly, listening for a footstep that hasn't yet been made. Someone offers bread wrapped in cloth. She touches the package like it might tell her something. A glance, a nod, two people agreeing to speak some other time in some other language. On market day, dust lifts from the road in low spirits. Mules stamping barrels, tipping a slow argument between price and hunger. A man sells ribbon out of a box, colors that look too loud for this much heat. A woman barters soap for salt, the coins making their small official sounds. A printer from town has nailed handbills in the shade-black letters, thick as thunderheads, names fattened with importance. At the edge, a traveling photographer has raised his tent, a darkroom on legs, dragon's breath of ether, and collodion curling around his sleeves. He sets his wooden camera on a tripod, a square eye staring without blinking. Plates soak hands, stain the chemistry of seeing leaves, a sting in the throat. Exposure asks for stillness, 10 seconds, 20. The kind of silence where you can hear what the heart truly wants to say. He makes his rounds, families, workers, a man with a hat tilted just so, each post trying to bargain with time. When his eye finds Etta, he hesitates that tiny beat, when instinct meets memory, and then he nods, as if answering a question only he heard. The day they say the picture was taken, the light felt held back. Not dim, but reluctant. Shadows didn't fall so much as gather corners, becoming rooms of their own. Etta sat with the patience of someone who has measured patience itself. Chin, level shoulders, easy gaze, like a path no one else can see. In the glass. The reflection is not untrue, but it is not the whole of it, a misfit angle, a light that seems to belong to another hour. Behind her, the porch boards record the weight of her, a register the camera cannot steal. Riders come and go along the ridge. Government men with paper in their saddlebags, men with less official reasons for riding at night. Boots mark the dust with certainty, then doubt, then pretense. They slow near the river, always the place where stories are known to change shape. One of them, older shoulders stubborn, will later say he saw a lantern over the water with no hand to carry it. He will swear the flame leaned toward a figure by the shore, and that when he blinked, the figure became moonlight on ripples. Letters travel the parish like small contraband birds inside sacks of flour between pages of hymnals tucked into seams. A name becomes a place becomes a time becomes a signal, a grammar of survival, spoken in glances. Maps are drawn in memory because paper has a way of finding the wrong eyes. Mothers teach directions disguised as lullabies, follow the star that looks tired. Count the cypress knees, trust the wind, only when it smells like rain. Children learn silence the way other children learn arithmetic, a skill, a shield, a door. Night lays its palm on the fields, warm wide, pressing every noise into the ground. The mill exhales and sleeps, steam gone iron, cooling with little clicks like cooling language. Across the road, something moves low. Not a person, not an animal. A movement without a name. Etta sits in the doorway with the candle unlit. She says, light can sometimes call the wrong things closer. The child laces fingers with hers, a small hand reading the news in a pulse. Rain begins without warning, not from a cloud, but from the air itself, as if the night has remembered a debt. The roof answers in a soft drumbeat, the kind that makes an old tattoo on the heart ache with recognition. Etta closes her eyes and hears what the rain is saying. Names you can't hear if you're afraid, instructions you can't follow if you're rushed. Somewhere a whippoorwill calls and is answered, an old conversation resumed. In the swamp a plank shifts, then stops, and stillness tightens like a knot being tested. Louisiana, 1854. A year that behaves like a room with two doors, one everyone uses and one only a few can see. Historians will later argue about records that went missing, ledgers, smudged dates, doubled names spelled one way here and another way there. Folklore will do what folklore does, make the gaps into bridges, the silences into choruses. But before argument and aftermath, there is this, a woman on a porch at the hour when even the river holds its breath. She is watching not the road, not the sky, the space where those two things meet. The camera drinks the moment and keeps what it can, a fraction of a second bottled like medicine. What it cannot keep is what the night keeps, the arrangement of fear and courage under her ribs, the itinerary of hope in her jaw. People will say, she knew something, a choice, a crossing, a reckoning that walked with soft feet. They will say many things, and the photograph will say almost nothing. And between those two statements, a truth will stand patient, unblinking. This is the ground she stands on, damp, bruised with footsteps, mapped by secrets. And this is the sky that refuses to forget. If you listen long enough, you will hear the bell from the barge again, thin, stubborn, faithful as a promise. If you look long enough, you will see the light that doesn't belong to this hour, a hesitant shine gathered in the angle of her eye. And if you breathe with the field slow, quiet, careful, you might understand why the crickets stop when they do, and why tonight they have not started again. The record begins in fragments. A torn newspaper clipping, a ledger entry without a full name, a note written in the back of a church registry where it shouldn't have been. Every document speaks half a truth, as if the other half was carried away by the wind that night. The first mention appears in the Louisiana Courier, September 8, 1854. A brief line beneath the advertisements and steamship schedules. Photographer missing along the lower parish road. Last seen departing for St. Martinville. Plate boxes not recovered. No follow-up. No investigation. The paper moved on to crop yields, river levels, and the price of sugar by the ton. But in the corner, a handwritten mark, faint pencil. Someone's private hand, find the woman. The archivists who found it said the note was modern ink, written long after the page itself. In the county ledger, under property inventory, a single phrase lingers without context. One image plate of unidentified female subject held for appraisal. No description, no reference number. Just the weight of bureaucracy pretending not to care. The Freedmen's Bureau records won't exist for another decade. But already the language of ownership and absence had begun to twist together. When the Bureau later cataloged names, they found entire families missing from the census households that had vanished before emancipation, not after. The parish clerk explained it away as migration. But along the bayou stories said otherwise. Children whispered about a wagon that came at night, no sound of hooves, just wheels turning slow on damp earth. The driver wore no hat, no coat, his shoulders thin, his face hidden by shadow. He never spoke, they said, only held out his hand to anyone waiting by the road. Those who stepped forward were gone before dawn. Those who watched swore they saw the wagon sink into the fog, its lantern burning green. It was called the carrying light, a phrase older than anyone could trace. Some said it was the spirit of a man who'd escaped long ago come back to guide others north. Others said it was a punishment, that he was doomed to walk the road forever, gathering souls who broke their oaths. The story shifted depending on who told it. But one detail never changed the lantern. Always that pale floating glow moving against the wind. In the archives of St. Landry Parish, a plantation ledger from 1854 lists a payment made to Mr. J. Sturdivant, itinerant portraitist. Beside it, a note in smaller script, returned without horse, claims illness, requests compensation for lost equipment. Then, in another hand, entirely rougher, darker ink, refused, account closed. No one knows who wrote the last line. The handwriting doesn't match any clerk of the time. The ink under ultraviolet examination dates later, 1870s perhaps, like someone revisited the page and wanted the story to end quietly. But the folklore doesn't let it rest. The people who stayed near the river, the ones who worked the cane and cut timber in the swamps, tell it differently. They say the photographer wasn't lost. He was taken. That one evening he set his camera to the woman's face and saw something in the glass he wasn't supposed to see. That he ran, but the light followed him all the way to the water. And when they found his horse days later, the saddle was dry, though it had rained all week. One of the oldest WPA interviews, recorded 70 years later, recalls an elder named Mariah speaking of the man who caught truth in a box. Her voice trembling through the hiss of tape. He took her picture, yes he did. But he didn't take what was really there. That part went home with her. You can't steal what's meant to stay. The interviewer laughs nervously. You can hear it. Mariah continues softer. He thought he could freeze time. But time don't like to be trapped. It come looking for him. Found him by the bayou mouth, staring at his own reflection. The official explanation was simpler. Fever exhaustion, misadventure. The coroner wrote, likely drowned. But his body was found on dry land. And when they opened his camera case, the plates were gone, replaced by one strip of linen tied in a knot. Inside the knot, a single dark hair and a scrap of paper that read, she saw, "It's easy to dismiss the kind of story told when work ends and the fire burns low." But patterns begin to surface. Between 1852 and 1855, 6 itinerant photographers disappear in southern Louisiana. Each reported last seen near the bayou settlements west of the river. Each carried new collodion equipment, expensive, delicate, easily broken. None of it ever recovered. The newspapers called them unfortunate wanderers. The locals called them the catchers of souls. Because in some old beliefs, older than Louisiana, older than the Americas, a photograph could take a piece of the living. And if the one photographed carried too much grief, the lens would not let go. A field note by a Baptist missionary mentions strange unease among parish workers that many refuse to be photographed for church records. He writes, "They claim the box steals warmth from the body. That faces caught within it fall sick in a fortnight." He dismisses it as ignorance, yet 2 weeks later his own assistant fell ill, muttering about light that breathes. In the oral tales that follow, retold for decades. Under porches and in revival tents, the story of Etta and the man with the camera becomes blurred with myth. Some say she wasn't a woman at all, but a keeper, a watcher who guarded crossroads and buried names. Some say she spoke to the river, and the river answered in thunder. Some say she lived forever unchanged because she never once stepped into her own reflection. But one account stands out, a letter written in 1891 by a journalist researching the folklore of the region. Everywhere I go, they speak of her. Sometimes she has a name, sometimes she does not. Always there is the eye, the gaze that looks both forward and backward at once. They say she knew the road that led out of this place, but never took it. She was waiting for something left undone. Fact and folklore now braid together, impossible to separate. The missing man, the photograph, the unspoken name. The official records claim coincidence, but the rhythm of disappearance suggests design. Somewhere in that gap between the ink that fades and the stories that won't lies a truth older than documentation. A truth that moves at night along the river's edge in the hush between the last hymn and the first cry of dawn. And maybe that's why when you hold the surviving photograph under light, her eyes still seem to follow you. Not accusing, not afraid, just knowing. Before we move deeper, leave a thought below. Do you believe history forgets by accident or by intention? Because in this story, forgetting may be the only way the truth survived. The story would not stay put. It learned to travel, took on legs, borrowed voices, and walked upriver one parish at a time. Every few months, another whisper, a disappearance, a burned house, a light no one could catch, each account beginning the same way. Someone saw the glow. The first winter tale hardened into a landmark. A cabin off Bayou Teche, a mother and two sons, their garden, a neat square of collards and mint. A wash line strung tight between two cypress knees. The night was clear, a dry kind of cold that carried the smell of iron from the river. Near dawn, a pale dome rose out of the marsh, not lightning, not moon, a breath of light that made shadows kneel. By the time neighbors ran the path, the cabin was cinder and chalk. No footprints leading in or out, only a ring where the ground refused grass for years, the soil glassy like a bottle's lip. They named it the field that remembers fire. Children dared one another to step inside at noon. Some said you could taste tin at the back of your tongue. Some said you could hear boiling when there was no pot. A month later, a parish line item noted relief stipend denied, cause uncertain. In pencil, a different hand added, no remains, no claim. 2 weeks after that, a flatboat went missing between Lafayette and St. Martinville. The current was sluggish, winter low, the banks wide as yawned mouths. At first, light barrels from the cargo thumped against willow roots, split rinsed of sugar bumping, as if making a slow apology. No planks, no nail burst, no rope ends to say goodbye. A fisherman named Chauvet swore he'd seen the craft drifting sideways at the false dawn lamp, swinging brighter than the sky. Brighter than any oil should burn. He called across water, got no answer. The glow rolled into mist and thinned to nothing. And when the real sun broke, there was only a clean seam in the current where something had been a moment before. By spring, rumor learned geometry. Store walls sprouted chalk circles where men argued routes. Midwives sketched their own maps in the margins of almanacs. Boatmen pointed with the handles of their pipes. Patterns emerged, arcs along the same curve of river, a chain of bends that lined up like beads. In the mouths that carried these shapes, a name gathered, the keeper of the bend. They said a woman stood there some nights, head bowed, hands linked, eyes reflecting lantern fire, though no lantern hung by her. Travelers began timing journeys by the stubborn logic of dusk, better to sleep in a ditch than walk past that place after sundown. The toll man at the crossing kept a ledger neat as a haircut. For 3 months his receipts took a bite out of daylight, then went thin as thread after twilight, as if night itself collected a hidden tax. Witnesses, some steady, some shaky, left trails of words that refused to match entirely. Alma Rivet, who took in washing by the levee, said she saw the woman in a window pane, not outside, but inside the glass, as if the room held her, while the exterior let her go. I turned to call my sister. Alma told her granddaughter decades later. And when I looked back, there was only steam, and my own face wearing an expression I didn't recognize. For a month after Alma refused mirrors, she wiped condensation with the back of her wrist and would not let the cloth touch her own reflection. A field hand turned preacher, Isaiah Dorsey, added a hinge to the story. Isaiah's sermons carried more bone than lace. He spoke of duty of patience, hammered into shape by weather. One night he walked home beneath a willow so heavy it curtained the path lantern, stubborn in the damp flame, hitching like a tired breath. He said she spoke his name first, said it without question marks, a sound that knew its own spelling. He asked if she was lost. She smiled, and air cooled without wind. When he glanced back to fix his place on the road, the path was water. When he looked forward again, the willow had stepped backward a pace. "You preach freedom," she said, the sentence falling like a scale weight. "But you still carry chains you can't see." He woke at home, lantern in his hand, wick clean as if it had never met fire. He resigned his pulpit 2 days later. Some say he apprenticed to a boat caulker and would not work by lamplight again. He kept a diary with one line on every page: "Name what you carry." Then a merchant's story drew the city's attention. A trader, Thibodeau, known for fair weights and a habit of humming, found a glass plate buried in damp clay where the bank had slumped. Half-broken emulsions scarred, yet inside the silver fog, you could make out a porch line, a slat-back chair, the ghost of a dress seam falling to an unseen knee. He wrapped it in cotton and posted it to a photographer in New Orleans, a man named Jules Favreau, whose card boasted of precise collodion. Favreau wrote that the plate fogged every time he breathed near it, and fogged again when he held his breath, like breath that refuses to belong to me. He tried alcohol, gentle wipes prayer. Each attempt left a new cloud shape, as if the image were migrating within its own skin. 3 weeks later, his studio burned from the chemical shelf outward. The insurer's report called the origin indeterminate. On the copy retained by his apprentice, a note in the margin began where the plate slept. Smaller incidents, the type that make a county's shoulders tighten, gathered like burrs. Children woke and stared at windows, convinced someone outside was humming a tune with no words. Mothers described the melody exactly the way the next mother did, yet none could sing it in daylight. At Nunc Picou's crossing, the ferryman refused to cast off after dusk, said the current had turned thoughtful. And when water starts thinking, a man ought not presume to speak for it with oar and rope. He lined his keel with salt and scratched a cross on the handle of his pole. Business suffered until men began crossing earlier, rather than test whatever the water wanted to say after dark. One afternoon, a farmer from 20 miles inland was found asleep on the levee, clothes dry under a spray of river silt and closed around a curl of hair that smelled faintly of mint and mud. He swore he'd been hoeing the back field, and then the sky had stepped too close. For days he dreamed of counting cypress knees in the wrong order. Fear rarely travels alone. It couples with ritual. Offerings began to appear where paths met bends. A sprig of river mint, a blue bead, a button polished smooth, a spoonful of cornmeal pressed into mud. No one admitted to leaving them. Everyone glanced downward when asked. An older woman called the practice paying the bend and spat twice to keep the act from attaching to her name. The hum Etta favored, low, unhurried, searching for a place to rest, spread through the fields first as a comfort, then as a signal. Some swore storms split around the parish when the tune threaded the rows. Others claimed the sound invited something that needed listening. City men came to laugh and left early. A journalist from Chartres Street wandered with a new notebook, wrote down phrases like collective hallucination and vapors of isolation. then abandoned the page for a sketch of the river's surface at night. A scribble of light he could not get right. He shipped north on the first morning boat. His notebook found at the inn. 2 days later carried a sentence formed and erased 3 times. Her eyes are not hers alone. Footprints became a chapter of their own pairs leading downhill. One set broad and certain, the other small and bare. At the margin of water, they separated the larger set, angling along the bank, the smaller stopping as if considering a next step that had not yet been invented. On the reed line, someone found a tin cup on its side, the dent at the lip shaped like a child's tooth. No one picked it up. Even memory sometimes keeps its hands at its sides. By harvest's end, northbound wagons outnumbered southbound ones. Families left behind rooms packed with the kind of silence that knows names. Chairs turned against tables, quilts folded like decisions, hearth ash smoothed as if expecting a return. A cracked mirror faced the wall. A clock lay unsprung on the mantel, hands nested together like sleeping birds. A census taker arrived late to his route and wrote, "Population decrease unexplained. Locals unwilling." Between the pages of his neat forms, someone slipped a parish map, circles smudged along the river's modest zig, each marked with a single initial. At the bottom margin, in a hand that didn't match his, "All gone where the light bends." Years unspooled and laid a second layer of evidence without meaning to. In 1923, a surveyor charting soil density for a new rail spur plotted anomalies that looked like fever on skin's small zones of heat where shade should have cooled the ground. He labeled them residual. His notes clipped with a rusted pin accidentally laid over a copy of the old parish map, the circles of heat tracing the same river beads men had chalked on store walls in 1854 without ever using a thermometer. He did not know the older story. He wrote brisk and tidy, likely mineral pockets. And still the river kept its habit of remembering what people decide to forget. On nights when the sky practiced withholding no stars, just a press of dark like velvet laid over a table, a single flicker moved with the patience of someone walking home from a long way off. Not fast, not random. Steady as if carried by hands that left no prints. The name that people had given her, Keeper of the Bend, felt less like a person and more like a task that could move from soul to soul when needed. Some claimed they'd seen Etta herself at the water's edge, posture quiet gaze, engaged with something nobody else could see. Others insisted Etta had already given what she knew to the child at her side, that knowledge keeps its promises by changing its address. Louisiana rebuilt itself as it always does. Cane biting back at firehouses, lifted roofs, reshingled porches, swept ledgers made whole where numbers had slipped away. But some repairs only convince daylight. Night takes its own inventory. Walk the ridge, and you will find places where the air tastes like a struck nail, and others where it tastes like sugar, stirred with river water. Stand long enough, and even the bravest dog will refuse to cross a particular patch of shade. So the incidents rose, not like sparks bright and gone, but like embers that learn to travel underground, joining separating surfacing where the soil thins. A cabin that will not cool. A boat that will not be found. A preacher who will not raise his voice. A plate that will not stop breathing. A hum that will not leave the throat of the field, even when the field is empty. And through it a photograph endures. A porch line, a chair. A woman sitting like an answer the question hasn't earned yet. Eyes that accept the camera and then look past it as if into a bend that light itself respects. If you were there, what would you mark on your map? A circle to warn others away. Or a circle to show them where to stand and listen. Because in Louisiana, 1854, the place where stories gather is the same place where decisions are made slowly, steadily in the half-light, where the river decides what to keep. By the time the calendar agreed to call it a new year, 1855 on paper, the same breath in the fields, the trail of documents had grown from rumor into a pattern you could lay across a table. Letters rode north inside respectable envelopes, trade correspondence, crop accounts, notices for insurance renewals, and in the margins, where polite business leaves a little unguarded white, the same phrase kept appearing. She saw. Sometimes tilted at a shy angle, sometimes pressed hard enough to bruise the paper, sometimes written backward as if meant to be read in a mirror. On ledgers from St. Mary Parish, on a shipping invoice stamped at Plaquemine, even on a bill for replacement boiler rivets, she saw. The handwriting varied, the insistence did not. In Washington, where paper is supposed to decide what is real. The phrase surfaced in bundles, no clerk expected to read closely. Agricultural returns, sugar yields, rail proposals. A young copyist in 1870 circled 3 instances in red and wrote in the margin, neat and hopeful. Identify author, no reply. His supervisor refiled the stack under miscellaneous phenomena. The red circles waited there nearly a century, the ink fading into the color of dried tea, proof of attention, without an answer. Official reports wrestled with what the countryside had already learned to say. Reconstruction brought men in uniforms and men with pens. The first were obeyed in daylight, the second contested in whispers after dark. A ferry post log from 1867 notes low illumination, marsh gas probable then in softer graphite beneath moved against wind, unlike any known flame. A Union lieutenant kept a sketchbook, precise lines, cautious shading, and one page shows a bend in the river like a sleeping animal, a small glow traveling upriver where current should deny it. On the facing page, a half-started face, the left eye complete the right, absent, and the words, not looking at me, looking through me. His report filed the same week calls the glow phosphorescent emanation. His private page calls it a decision. Science did what it does, stacked measurements into theories. Chemists listed methane and marsh gas, described spontaneous ignition and the trick of refraction over warm water. Surveyors logged barometric pressures and heat signatures. A professor visiting from New York asked for local testimonies, then scribbled collective neurosis before boarding the steamer back east. None of them addressed the thing that made people lower their voices at dusk, not the light itself, but its courtesy. The way it paused at the same bend, returned to the same reach of bank, behaved as if bound to a route the parish knew in its bones. Physical evidence refused to stay purely physical. In 1908, engineers plotting flood routes near St. Martinville mapped soil that held heat where shade prevailed, little zones that read like fever on the land's skin. Digging at one, they found charred joists from an old foundation burn originated below the flooring, not above. Beneath the joists, the clay was stamped with a faint grain, as if something heavy had rested there for years and then stood up, leaving the memory of its weight. Nearby, a handful of glass plate fragments lay clotted with mud. Cleaned and fixed, they showed cane sky water, and on the right margin of 2 plates, an overexposed shape like a seated figure holding still. The engineers labeled the anomalies residual thermal pockets and light artifact. The foreman kept one shard for a keepsake. It was found in his coffin decades later, wrapped in linen that smelled faintly of mint. The press tried briefly to make sense at the speed of news. In 1892, Le Progrès de la Louisiane ran a column by Henri Dufour, an earnest man with a careful mustache titled The Light of the Bayou. He quoted an elderly midwife, Clara, who measured births against storms and remembered dates by the taste of the air. You call her Etta, Clara told him, but a name is just a key you carry. She was the lock. Some souls keep a door. Dufour printed the lines between ads for miracle soaps and rheumatism cures, a curiosity priced the same as a tonic. A week later, his office burned the sort of total that leaves only iron and guilt. In the box of warped type, one letter can still be read, the capital E bent like a neck, choosing not to bow. Academics arrived with notebooks and departed with doubts they couldn't publish. In the 1930s, WPA interviewers collected songs that the files called African spiritual variants, though the meter didn't settle into any comfortable grid. The lyrics shifted parish to parish, but the refrain kept its bones. The bend still glows. The river still turns, eyes in the dark, still watch what burns. Light me home, keeper. Unknown, I see the road, but not alone. Archivists penciled no origin traceable, likely composite. The older people who sang said origin wasn't the point, that a song is a way of carrying a place when your hands are already full. The deeper the files went, the more the pages admitted what the fields had never forgotten, that fact has seams and folklore knows where to pull. A court ledger from 1854 lists Mr. J. Sturdivant, itinerant portraitist, compensation dispute. Margin note: returned without horse claims, lost by illness. Second-hand darker ink, later decade refused. On a separate page, a small knot of linen is pinned, the pin long rusted, and beneath it, one hair dark as river mud, and a scrap that reads simply, "She saw." No explanation for why evidence should be stored, as if a person might know how to read touch. Meanwhile, the road itself offered its commentary in asphalt, without footnotes. In 1923, a surveyor recharted the parish, with a neatness that looked like courtesy. His heat map dots, harmless on their own, traced a necklace of circles that mirrored an 1854 chalk map men drew on a store wall with pipe stems and stubbornness. He wrote brisk mineral pockets, then redrafted the rail spur to bow around the bend by a few degrees. Planners, a century later, repeated the gesture lines on paper, curving as if a hand remembered being guided when it was young. Folklore did not sit politely and wait its turn. It arrived at the same table and rearranged the cutlery. The old women said the light was not a haunting, but a practice, a vigil kept by a living person for the sake of the unnamed. Etta, they insisted, had taken a place rather than fled one. She stood where the road forgets itself, and the river recalls, counting what the ledgers lost, holding open what the documents would close. You face east when you sing, a mother instructs her daughter, so your sound can find her. Let her count you. The daughter asks why. The mother says, because someone has to keep score when history refuses. Dream narratives, the kind officials write off as weather in the skull, lined up with entries nobody could dismiss. A postal clerk long after the war described smelling burnt sugar in a night office with no stove. In the sorting glass, a seated figure appeared when the lights dimmed in a brownout, then eased away when power steadied. He wrote a confession to himself. Not afraid. Corrected. As if someone had nudged his spine back into true. And then there is the discipline of names. Their absence, their doubling, their disguise. Friedman's lists of the late 1860s show gaps in family groups that predates emancipation disappearances. The bureaucrats label migration because it fits the column. Oral accounts put those same gaps at the river's bend, not vanishing into nothing, but vanishing into direction, a going toward that required secrecy. The carrying light first told as a warning to keep children from wandering, doubles as a guide, when whispered among adults, a sign that the road north had opened one more notch, that the river would lend its edges for walking if the watcher at the bend agreed. So Fact 2 stacks its boxes, ledgers, logs, affidavits, surveys, and Folklore 2 sets a candle in front of them and asks what the boxes forgot to feel. The chemist can name methane. The midwife can name the sound a door makes when it opens between what happened and what people say happened. The lieutenant can sketch a glow. The singer can tell you which note makes the field lean closer. The engineer can measure heat in shaded soil. The elder can point to a patch of air that tastes like a struck nail and say, "Not here. Not now." If you force a choice, the parish refuses. It will keep both the tidy phrase, phosphorescent haze, and the older sentence, eyes in the dark, still watch what burns. It will keep residual thermal pockets and the quiet correction places that remember. It will keep the ruined studio report and the bent letter E. It will keep the plate shard wrapped in linen and the inventory entry that pretends cloth and hair are not evidence. It will keep the lieutenant's official line and his private one, the one that admits he felt seen. And perhaps that is what she saw, not a prediction, not a curse, but a structure. A way the land and the people contrived together to keep a promise. A photograph that refuses to settle into one century. A river that insists roads should bow. A community that teaches its children how to sing distance into something with a handle. A woman who sits like a hinge, not closing the door, not opening it too wide, just keeping it from forgetting how to move. The historians will keep arguing their job is to find edges and name them. The singers will keep humming their job is to blur edges until passage is possible. Paper will keep trying to settle dust. Footsteps will keep lifting it. Somewhere in the parish office, a file labeled Miscellaneous Phenomena will keep receiving misfit pages, and somewhere by the bend, people will keep leaving a sprig of mint, a blue bead, a single coin pressed into mud. Not superstition, but acknowledgement. A receipt for something shared and not easily priced. So when fact and folklore meet in this story, they do not collide, they laminate. One layer shines, the other warms. Together they refuse to tear cleanly. And at the center of that laminate sits a photographed porch-lined slat-back chair, a woman whose gaze belongs to both the moment the plate drank and a future still deciding how to tell itself. Look long enough, and you will feel the same courtesy the light shows. The river a pause where decision gathers. Look away too quickly, and you will miss it, the small debt the present owes to the eyes that kept watch when paper would not. If you were there, what would you mark on your map? A circle to warn others away, or a circle to show them where to stand and listen, because in Louisiana, 1854, the place where stories gather is the same place where decisions are made slowly, steadily in the half-light, where the river decides what to keep. By the time the century turned its face toward war and freedom, and the slow machinery of progress, the story of Etta and the light at the bend had already soaked too deep into Louisiana's soil to be undone. People called it a folktale, a warning, a haunting. But when the state archivists began cataloging 19th century parish files, something odd surfaced. Folders meant to hold tax rolls from 1854 through 1856 contained not numbers, but sketches, crude pencil drawings of a river bend, dotted with circles, every one labeled unassigned. Ink bled through as though the paper had been damp before it ever met a clerk's desk. Half the pages smelled faintly of smoke. A researcher named Dandridge, working out of Baton Rouge in the 1930s, followed the trail. He wrote that the ledger hands changed mid-entry. One day's script, careful, the next jagged pressed too hard. Marginalia, that read recount on return beside entries for the very families that vanished. He spent months tracing each initial from the charcoal map found with the census man's notes. Every letter corresponded to a household that disappeared before emancipation. All their inventories intact, all their debts canceled in one stroke of pen. He filed his report in triplicate. The first copy went missing from the courthouse. The second he mailed to the Library of Congress. The third he kept for himself, hidden behind the panel of an oak desk. It was discovered in 1974, sealed in wax, the ribbon still taut. Inside 47 pages of correspondence, a single photograph and a final paragraph written in uneven lines. They were not erased. They crossed. Records were not kept because records would not hold them. Scholars dismissed it as poetic confusion, the fatigue of an aging historian chasing coincidence through swampland dust. Yet among his notes was a name Etta R., with a mark beside it, not an asterisk or a dash, but a small circle filled with graphite. Beneath a second hand, added later, found in image plate, negative exposure reversed. When the surviving plate was re-examined under new light in the 1950s, the details deepened. Where once there had been shadow, now there was shape, faint outlines of a child's face reflected in the window glass beside her. No record ever listed a child. No local registry matched the features. But beneath the surface emulsion etched by hand before the plate hardened, were 4 tiny words scratched so faintly they escaped notice for nearly a century. Hold the line steady. No one could say whose hand wrote it, photographer, subject, or someone unseen. Yet the phrase began echoing across Louisiana's oral histories, appearing in songs of the river workers, in the chants of levee builders, in the humming cadence of midwives waiting through long nights. Each generation repeated it slightly differently. Hold the line. Hold steady. Steady the light. The words became code prayer compass. But the deeper bridge, the thread that connects record to rumor, lies in the contradictions between those who studied and those who remembered. Official reports insist there was one woman, one image, one story, misplaced among countless others. The storytellers insist there were many, each taking her place when the river called for witness. They say that every 30 years or so, a photograph surfaces in a family's trunk, same posture, same gaze, same calm refusal to age. And every time before anyone can trace the image, it goes missing. A librarian in New Orleans recounted an evening in 1961 when a young woman came to the reading room asking for Dandridge's files. She spoke softly, carried a single envelope, and signed the register as E. Rivers. She read for hours, copying nothing, turning each page as though listening rather than seeing. When the librarian returned with tea, the chair was empty. The folder closed, a faint ring of moisture on the desk, like a fingerprint of breath. The register line blurred overnight, the ink running until only the letter E remained. Climax does not mean resolution, not in stories like this. It means the past remembering itself too loudly to stay quiet. In 2003, ground-penetrating radar mapped the old river road near St. Martinville before a pipeline project. Beneath the cane, technicians found rows of voids, rectangular, evenly spaced, each about the length of a man, some smaller. No markers, no nails, no bones, just air pockets where earth had refused compaction, as if something lighter than soil persisted. The report listed them as historical anomalies. When the data overlay was compared to the charcoal circles from 1854, the match was exact. A visiting professor from Tulane, reviewing the scans, noted a faint magnetic field fluctuation along the same arc, barely measurable but consistent. She joked in her notes, "The river remembers electricity before Edison." Then a month later, she withdrew her grant citing personal reasons and left the state. Her assistant kept the files. They've never been published, but copies circulate quietly among graduate students who study folklore more seriously than physics. Fact bends until it becomes folklore. Folklore straightens until it reads like record. Somewhere in the hinge between the two, the light still moves. At dusk, locals say it hovers low over the bayou's surface, steady, unwavering, bright enough to paint silver on the reeds. It stops where the bend deepens, where the water swallows its own reflection, then fades, not out but inward, as if returning to the hand that first held it. And always in the photograph, her eyes hold the same expression, not fear, not warning, understanding. The kind of knowing that refuses translation. When historians magnify the image, dust rises on the print like fine mist, and for a heartbeat, it looks as though her lips have parted. As though she's about to finish the sentence, history keeps interrupting. Time did what it always does. It buried what it could not understand. The river changed course, swallowed a few feet of bank each decade, rewrote its own grammar. Bridges rose and fell, floods came, and left towns renamed themselves to survive embarrassment or debt. But in the old parish records, the years around 1854 still read like a page smudged by an unwashed hand. Whole lines, blurred ledgers stitched together from memory rather than ink. The officials blamed mold, humidity, neglect. Those who lived close to the bend knew better. Etta's name, if that was ever her name, became a quiet password between generations. A whisper traded in kitchens, in the rows in the back pews of churches rebuilt after storms. Etta saw, they'd say, when someone spoke a truth too heavy for daylight. It meant remember what is being hidden. It meant some light must be carried in secret. And so the story kept breathing through songs, through photographs tucked behind portraits of soldiers, through silence that tasted of molasses and rain. By reconstruction, the photograph had become a rumor again. Traveling preachers claimed to have seen it. Archivists denied it existed. One 1879 catalog of local curiosities lists only this. Glass plate of uncertain provenance features female subject. Eyes appear responsive to light. No location given, no price. Just a small note in the margin not to be displayed after sundown. By the early 1900s, spirituals across the South began to borrow her image. In one, she's a watcher, a woman who waits at the water's edge until every lost soul finds its way home. In another, she's a messenger, warning the living not to forget the dead who built their path. And in one rare recording from 1932, brittle acetate singer, unknown. The verse repeats over and over. She carried the line steady. She carried the line steady. No one knows if the singer understood what those words meant. But each time her voice cracks on steady, you can hear the sound of someone holding their breath too long. The folklore began to reshape itself in the age of machines. By the 1950s, the ghost was less a woman than a phenomenon. A residual pulse of light following the contours of the old river road. UFO enthusiasts came, measured air density, photographed nothing. One left a note in a local diner, light too old for the camera. A decade later, a poet in New Orleans wrote of a dream where the woman's gaze turned into a river and the river whispered names in reverse. The poem was never published, but copies of it drifted through universities quoted without title, author unknown. In 1989, an historian restoring antebellum photographs in a Baton Rouge lab found a fragment of glass wrapped in linen, misfiled, unlabeled, shipped from a private estate near St. Martinville. When light hit it, the shape of a woman's face appeared for an instant, then vanished. He blamed chemical residue. But the linen carried a watermark dated 1854, and a small circular burn no bigger than a coin in the exact center. He sealed it in a case and never spoke publicly about it. His daughter later donated his papers to Tulane, the box labeled, "Personal, not for cataloging," remains unopened. Meanwhile, the local stories refused extinction. Farmers on foggy mornings still see the same shimmer near the cane's soft patient-like dawn rehearsing itself. Boatmen swear that certain currents run colder even in summer. Children dare each other to whistle her tune, 3 notes rising, 1 falling, and run if the echo answers. And in every retelling, Etta's eyes grow calmer, clearer, as if the story itself were learning to rest. Some say the light is no longer warning, it's remembrance. That every person who tells the story, every tongue that shapes her name gives her another moment of peace. Others insist it's unfinished, that something still walks the waterline, counting the ones the record forgot. But whichever version you believe, Louisiana remains what it has always been, a place where the river writes in 2 languages, one for history and one for memory. And between them stands a photograph that refuses to fade. Look again, not at her face, but at the space between her eyes and the camera. That small distance, that breath of air, is where everything that was lost still lives. The moment before the shutter closed. The silence before truth turned into evidence. The second when her gaze crossed the lens and saw us waiting in the future, trying to remember her without really knowing why. The past never ends, it only changes address. Each retelling opens the door again, and light slips through the crack. And maybe, just maybe, the story keeps repeating because it wants company, a listener willing to look back and not look away. So if you're still here, if her eyes are still in your mind, leave a trace below. Write where you're listening from, or what the photograph makes you feel. Because every word you leave becomes another lantern along the bend, and somewhere beneath the Louisiana night, the river will notice and whisper your name back.